How accurate is Red Dead Redemption 2 game? Let's check this out. Starting with gang structure. The Van der Linde gang in RDR2 is shown as a diverse group of outlaws, including people of different ethnicities, backgrounds, and even a Native American member. While this might seem like modern inclusivity at play, historical records actually show that many outlaw gangs were surprisingly diverse. Take the real-life Cherokee Bills gang, which included African American, Native American, and white members. The James Younger gang also frequently worked with Hispanic and Native American outlaws. The game's portrayal of gang hideouts in remote areas, from snowy mountains to swamps, is pretty spot on. Historical gangs like Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch were known to use places like Robber's Roost in Utah, a remote hideout that was nearly impossible for law enforcement to access. These locations, called outlaw trails, stretched from Montana to Mexico, creating a network of safe havens for criminals. However, RDR2 dramatizes the frequency of gang warfare. While conflicts between gangs did occur, they weren't as common as the game suggests. Most gangs actually tried to avoid each other, focusing instead on their own territories and targets. The infamous Wild Bunch operated for years without significant rivalry from other gangs. They were more concerned with evading law enforcement than fighting other outlaws. The game's depiction of gang structure and leadership is interestingly accurate. Dutch van der Linde's charismatic leadership style mirrors real-life gang leaders like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy, who were known for their charm and ability to inspire loyalty. Many historical gangs operated like dysfunctional families, similar to how the van der Linde gang is portrayed, with complex relationships and internal politics.
One aspect the game nails is the impact of modernization on outlaw life. The story's themes of a dying Wild West reflect the historical reality of the 1890s, when railroads, telegraphs, and improved law enforcement were making traditional outlawry increasingly difficult. Many real gangs, like the Wild Bunch, found themselves struggling to adapt to these changes, just as Dutch's gang does in the game. The game takes some creative liberties with the size of gangs. The Van der Linde gang, with over 20 members, would have been unusually large for its time. Most historical outlaw gangs were smaller, typically consisting of 4 to 12 members. Larger groups were harder to manage and more likely to attract attention. RDR2's portrayal of gang activities is a mix of fact and fiction. While train robberies and bank heists did occur, they weren't as frequent as the game suggests. Most gangs survived through smaller crimes like horse theft, cattle rustling, and robbing stagecoaches. The game's dramatic heists would have been rare, high-risk operations in reality. The game's representation of gang codes and honor among thieves has some historical basis. Many real outlaw gangs had unofficial rules about not killing unnecessarily and sharing spoils equally. However, these codes were broken more often than the romanticized versions would suggest. The noble outlaw archetype, while based on some true elements, was largely a creation of dime novels and early Hollywood. Now, law enforcement. One of the most realistic aspects of RDR2 is its depiction of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, called the Pinkertons in-game. The real Pinkertons were indeed as ruthless and persistent as shown, often employed by railroad companies and banks to hunt down outlaws. They were essentially a private army, with more agents than the entire US Army at one point in the 1870s. Just like in the game, they would pursue gangs across state lines, something local lawmen couldn't legally do. But in reality, communication was much slower. Without modern radio, it could take hours or even days for news of a crime to reach lawmen. The game's instant response times and immediate deployment of large posses, while exciting for gameplay, wouldn't have been possible in 1899. The bounty system in RDR2 is based on historical practice but simplified for gameplay. Real bounty hunting was more complex and less frequent than shown. Most criminals were actually caught by law enforcement officers rather than bounty hunters. When bounties were issued, they weren't automatically posted across entire states. They had to be physically distributed through wanted posters and newspaper advertisements. The game accurately portrays the varied nature of law enforcement in the Old West. You encounter town sheriffs, US Marshals, and county deputies, all with different jurisdictions and authority levels. This reflects the real hierarchical system of the time. Local sheriffs handled most day-to-day law enforcement, while US Marshals dealt with federal crimes and cross-territory pursuits. The corruption shown among law enforcement is historically accurate. Many real sheriffs and deputies were indeed on the payroll of wealthy ranchers or railroad companies. Some lawmen even moonlighted as outlaws. Take Henry Newton Brown, who served as a respected sheriff while secretly robbing banks in other jurisdictions. RDR2's portrayal of small-town jails is surprisingly accurate. These facilities were often simple buildings with a few cells, doubling as the sheriff's office. However, the game's depiction of prison breaks being relatively common is exaggerated. While they did happen, successful escapes were rare due to the harsh consequences. Escaped prisoners were often shot on sight. The game's representation of lawmen's weapons and equipment is quite authentic. Most carried Colt revolvers and Winchester rifles, similar to what we see in-game. But the game underplays the importance of shotguns, which were actually the preferred weapon for close-range law enforcement in towns. One aspect the game dramatizes is the frequency of shootouts. Real lawmen preferred to arrest suspects without violence when possible. Famous lawmen like Wyatt Earp claim to have rarely drawn their weapons throughout their careers. The shoot-first approach shown in the game was more exception than rule. The portrayal of law enforcement jurisdiction is somewhat simplified. In reality, the legal system was more complex, with overlapping authorities between different agencies. A sheriff's authority ended at county lines, and crossing state borders required extensive paperwork and cooperation between different law enforcement agencies. The game captures the evolving nature of law enforcement during this period. By 1899, the Wild West was becoming more organized and regulated. The emergence of forensic techniques, improved communication through telegraphs, and the beginning of fingerprinting were gradually transforming law enforcement from frontier justice to modern policing. What's missing from the game is the role of town ordinances and civil law enforcement. Many Western towns had strict laws about carrying weapons within city limits, and much of a lawman's time was spent enforcing minor regulations rather than chasing dangerous outlaws. To wrap things up, Red Dead Redemption 2 offers a mixed bag when it comes to historical accuracy in law enforcement. Now we're the gang's brokies as shown in the game. The game's depiction of gang finances being unstable and unreliable is surprisingly accurate. Historical records show that most outlaw gangs lived through boom and bust cycles, much like Dutch's gang. Take the famous James Younger gang. Despite pulling off some of the largest robberies of their era, they often found themselves short on cash between big scores. Why? Because maintaining a gang was incredibly expensive, just as the game shows. One aspect RDR2 absolutely nails is the impact of failed heists on gang finances. The Blackwater ferry job that goes wrong at the start of the game mirrors real historical examples. The Dalton gang's attempted double bank robbery in Coffeyville, Kansas, left most of the gang dead and the survivors penniless. One bad job could indeed destroy a gang's finances and force them to scramble for money, exactly as we see Dutch's gang do. The game accurately shows how gangs needed constant income to survive. Basic necessities like food, ammunition, horses, and bribes required steady cash flow. Historical records from captured gang members reveal that maintaining horses alone was a major expense. Each horse needed food, shoes, and occasional veterinary care. The game reflects this through camp upgrade requirements and the constant need for supplies. But RDR2 somewhat understates the profitability of small-scale crimes. In reality, gangs made significant money from horse theft and cattle rustling. These weren't glamorous crimes, but they provided more reliable income than the big heists the game focuses on. For example, the Hole-in-the-Wall gang made substantial profits from cattle rustling, which was less risky and more profitable than bank robberies. The game's portrayal of gangs needing to move frequently and establish new camps is historically accurate and reflects a major financial drain. Each move required resources, new supplies, and often bribes to keep locations secret. The Wild Bunch was known to spend significant amounts maintaining their network of safe houses and informants. One aspect the game accurately portrays is how gangs had to adapt to changing economic conditions. As the West became more developed, traditional criminal enterprises became less profitable. Train robberies, for instance, became increasingly difficult as companies improved security. This economic pressure forced many real gangs, like Dutch's gang in the game, to take greater risks for diminishing returns. The game's depiction of gang savings being hidden in various locations was common practice. The James gang was known to bury their loot in multiple locations, much like Dutch's money stashes. This was partly due to the lack of banking options for outlaws, but it also led to lost or forgotten caches of money, something many real Western historians have documented. The financial pressure on gang members to contribute to the camp fund has historical basis. Real gangs often operated on a shared economy system, with members expected to contribute to common expenses. However, the game's formalized contribution system is more structured than historical accounts suggest. RDR2 correctly shows how gangs often diversified their criminal activities. When one type of crime became too risky or unprofitable, they'd switch to another. The real-life Butch Cassidy started with horse theft, moved to cattle rustling, and only later attempted larger bank and train robberies, a progression similar to what we see in the game. What the game doesn't fully capture is the role of fence networks in gang finances. Historical gangs relied heavily on networks of corrupt merchants and traders who would buy stolen goods at discount prices. These networks were crucial for converting stolen items into usable cash, though they often took a large cut of the profits. The struggle to maintain a large group, as shown in the game, is historically accurate. Bigger gangs meant more mouths to feed and more people to pay, which created constant financial pressure. This explains why most real gangs were smaller than the Van der Linde gang. They were simply more economically viable. RDR2's method of stopping trains is surprisingly accurate. Real outlaws used similar techniques like placing obstacles on the tracks or showing lantern signals to make trains stop. The Butch Cassidy gang was known for using red lanterns to trick engineers into thinking there was danger ahead. However, the game doesn't show one common method. Outlaws sometimes boarded trains as regular passengers before making their move. The game's portrayal of robbers targeting the express car, where valuables were kept, is historically accurate. The James Younger gang specifically focused on express safes, which contained cash shipments and valuable items. However, real robberies rarely involved dynamite. Most gangs used threatening the express messenger or having skilled safecrackers work on the locks, as dynamite could destroy the valuable contents. One aspect RDR2 gets wrong is the response time. In the game, law enforcement often appears within minutes. In reality, trains could be stuck for hours after a robbery with no help in sight. The Hole-in-the-Wall gang once spent nearly 3 hours trying to crack a safe during a robbery near Wilcox, Wyoming, with no interruption from law enforcement. The game's depiction of robbers taking passenger valuables was less common in reality. Most professional train robbers focused solely on the express car and mail car, ignoring passengers entirely. The reason was simple. Passenger valuables were harder to fence and more easily traceable than banknotes or gold shipments. Sam Bass, a notorious train robber, specifically instructed his gang to leave passengers alone to avoid additional charges if caught. RDR2 accurately shows how gangs needed inside information for successful train robberies. Many historical heists involved railroad employees who provided schedules and information about valuable shipments. The Wild Bunch was known for having an extensive network of informants within the railroad companies. The positioning of guards and security measures shown in the game is pretty accurate for the era. After a wave of robberies in the 1870s, railroads began placing armed guards in express cars and installing better safes. The game shows this evolution, with later game trains having tougher security, just as they did historically. However, the game misses one crucial detail. Most successful train robberies happened at night. Daylight robberies were rare because they made the gang too visible and vulnerable. The infamous Blackjack Ketchum gang specifically planned their robberies on moonless nights to maximize darkness and confusion. The game's portrayal of escape plans is somewhat simplified. Real gangs put more emphasis on their getaway than the actual robbery. They would often have fresh horses stationed miles from the robbery site and split up into smaller groups to evade pursuit. Some gangs even planted false trails to confuse posses. One interesting detail the game omits is how railroads fought back. Companies like Union Pacific developed special pursuit trains, equipped with horses and armed guards, that could be quickly dispatched to chase robbers. They also hired specialized detectives and offered substantial rewards, making train robbery increasingly risky by the late 1890s. The aftermath of train robberies in RDR2 is fairly accurate. Successfully robbing a train did often lead to extended pursuit by law enforcement across multiple states, just as we see in the game. The Pinkertons would indeed chase gangs for months or even years after a major train robbery. An aspect the game doesn't fully explore is how unpredictable train robbery profits could be. Sometimes gangs would hit a train carrying massive payrolls, while other times they'd find barely enough to cover their expenses. The Wild Bunch's last train robbery near Wagner, Montana, netted them only $40,000 in gold coins, a decent haul, but far less than expected for the risk involved. Also, bounty hunting. First up, let's address that iconic wanted dead or alive poster system. While RDR2's automatic bounty board updates are obviously gamified, the use of wanted posters was absolutely real. However, here's a fun fact. Real wanted posters rarely offered the dead or alive option. Most bounties specifically requested suspects to be brought in alive. Dead bounties usually paid significantly less because, well, courts preferred to actually try their criminals. The game's portrayal of bounty rewards is pretty inflated for gameplay fun. In reality, most bounties ranged from $50 to $200, equivalent to roughly $1,500 to $6,000 today. Those massive $1,000 bounties in RDR2 were extremely rare in real life, usually reserved for the most notorious outlaws like Butch Cassidy or Billy the Kid. Real bounty hunters had to get proper authorization from law enforcement and couldn't just run around capturing people. They needed to prove their identity and show documentation for each capture. Not quite as exciting as the game's shoot first, ask questions later approach. But hey, bureaucracy existed even in the Wild West. The tracking mechanics in the game are actually more sophisticated than what real bounty hunters typically used. Most historical bounty hunters relied heavily on information from locals, telegrams about recent sightings, and good old-fashioned detective work. They didn't have magical eagle eye abilities. Shocking, I know. They were more like private investigators than the action heroes we play in the game. Here's something interesting. The game's portrayal of bounty hunters working alone or in small groups is pretty accurate. Famous bounty hunters like Charlie Siringo usually worked solo or with one partner. The massive posses we sometimes see in movies were more commonly formed by law enforcement rather than bounty hunters. RDR2 misses the mark on how long bounty hunting usually took. In the game, we wrap up most bounties in minutes or hours. In reality, tracking down a wanted person could take weeks or even months. Pat Garrett spent months tracking Billy the Kid. Not exactly the quick afternoon mission we're used to in the game. The competitive nature of bounty hunting shown in RDR2, where other hunters might try to steal your bounty, actually happened. There were some pretty heated rivalries between bounty hunters, and it wasn't uncommon for multiple hunters to chase the same target. Though they usually didn't get into the wild shootouts we see in the game. That would have been bad for business. The game's wanted system, where your bounty increases with each crime, is simplified but based on real practices. However, real bounties didn't magically appear the moment you committed a crime. News traveled slowly, and sometimes criminals were long gone before a bounty was even posted. Here's a fun detail. The game doesn't show how some bounty hunters became celebrities in their own right. They wrote books, did public speaking tours, and became famous figures. Imagine an Old West version of Dog the Bounty Hunter, and you've got the right idea. The territorial restrictions in RDR2 are pretty accurate. Bounty hunters did need different authorizations to operate across state lines. However, the game simplifies this for gameplay purposes. In reality, crossing state borders to catch someone was a whole legal mess that could invalidate the capture. Let's talk about transport. The game's method of bringing in bounties by horseback was common, but there's a missing detail. Real bounty hunters often waited for scheduled trains or stagecoaches to transport their captives, especially over long distances. Riding alone with a prisoner for days was incredibly risky. To wrap it all up, RDR2's bounty hunting system is like a greatest hits album of the Old West. It takes the most exciting parts of real bounty hunting and turns them up to 11 for entertainment. While the core concepts are based on historical fact, the game naturally makes everything more action-packed and immediate than the often slow, methodical reality. After all of these, we can safely assume that Red Dead Redemption 2 is fairly very accurate game, and Rockstar had actually put effort in it. You tell me in comment, what do you think? Subscribe to the channel and see ya.